more than welcome. But you are chairing the panel, so.
Okay, I'm in the double role right now. Yeah. I'm trying to see if Mauro is getting back.
Sorry, but okay. I'm going to have my dessert here while we're eating because I couldn't have. So
I think we'll just have to excuse you. Okay, so there was a small change of programming in order not to cause problems for Diana with respect to having to rush her presentation. She will be doing her presentation first, and then Edgar Cabanas will come second. Okay, there is Mauro as well. So Nico, ¿quieres grabar?
I'm recording now, and now we are on YouTube as well. So
okay, we're live. We're live and we're being recorded. Welcome back to this second panel of the workshop. We have 4 papers on the topic of the multiplicity of therapeutic cultures, rather diverse approaches and topics. There's for reasons of timing, Diana Espiritu Santo will be starting with her presentation. I ask you to have your presentation within about 25 minutes, and in the last 5 minutes, I will be letting you know that your time is about to be up. Okay, so the title of her presentation is she's Diana Espiritu Santo from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and the title of her presentation is The Noise of Trauma, Analytical Bridges Between the Paranormal and the Memory of the Political in Chilean Historicity. Diana, we're listening to you.
Thank you very much. I'm on sound, right? You can hear me. Good.
Yes.
Thank you, Piroska, and the organizers of this conference for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be among so many psychoanalysts and psychologists. It's not normal for us anthropologists. And I hope to be able to contribute something. I'm not sure, but you can then tell me later. So my paper is on this bridge between noise, as we conceive it in paranormal instrumentation, and the noise of trauma. Okay. Right. John D. Peters says that the, quote, radio signal is surely one of the strangest we know. Little wonder its ability to spirit intelligence through space elicited immediate comparisons to telepathy, seances, and angelic visitations. At any point on the Earth's surface in the 20th century, silent streams of radio voices, music, sound effects, and distress signals fill every corner of space. So this also turns to the question of who owns meaning. He asks, does nature speak? Does God speak? Does fate speak? Do bureaucracy speak? Or am I just making this all up? So is communication with a traumatic history a question of simply amplifying signals, somehow already there, lying underneath the sonic and material surface, or does it create these signals anew from the remnants of biographies and individual cognition? In either case, what would this communication look like? Would it be communicative or effective, or simply experiential, non-propositional? Further, how is history transmitted through signal or captured through the sound recording devices paranormalists use? And I'll get to that in a second. What would this history look like? So in this paper, I will deconstruct several levels of the concept of paranormal noise, by which I refer both to the white noise generated by electrical machines and the sounds it registers meaningfully or not. But I also examined the idea of historical sound, as well as the sound of memory, for a recently traumatized Chile, asking how sound and noise can be poised and unraveled as individual and social memory. Of equal importance are silences, the stillnesses of the void, where there's a marked silencing of memory and information in the case of Chilean dictatorship suffering. While the two are conspicuously different domains of social and historical understanding, I believe that both point to reconfiguring of sound as both revealing of and impactful to historical consciousness. So in a sense, this paper is less about psychology or psychoanalysis than it is actually about history. So history and sound. Jürgen Müller has argued that, quote, our historical memory is full of images, but almost void of sounds. The inaudibility of the greatest part of history cannot be overcome, since the sounds of history have irrevocably died away. As historians, we must apparently be content with the sound of silence. The assumption here is that the sounds of past times of history have vanished. Müller laments in particular that great historical speeches of the modern era, such as those of Cicero or Jefferson or Luther or Lincoln, are not accessible acoustically. We also have no idea what the acoustic stimuli was for the soldiers of the First World War, for instance. Historians must reconstruct these impressions from press reports, diaries, scientific findings on the effects of shell shock. But while not discounting the validity of these laments, nor the painstaking historical work that has gone into the reconstruction, Müller's understanding of historical sound is based on a particular vision of history itself. In an article that provides a critique of this, Loredo, Narciandi, and Castro Tejerina argue that Müller reproduces the false ideology of the time machine, the idea that if only we could go back in time, we could have an accurate understanding of the past. With this comes the idea of the authenticity of historical sound. Thus, sound becomes the way one can access the past without mediations. But as these authors argue, all investigations, whether historians, anthropologists, or scientists, quote, construct their objects through different classes of mediations. It is not the past that creates the memory, rather, it is the opposite. Müller's understanding of history is inextricably tied to historical realism, memory here serving as a repository of information, of facts, or in the best of circumstances. But as Loredo, Narciandi, and Castro Tejerina say, memory does not work as a registry. Facts can only be defined within a predetermined context of use and in relation to other meanings and artifacts implied in them. In effect, we are not looking for history in an analysis of sound. We are looking for both institutionalized and personal forms of history making. And this is the perspective I want to pursue in this paper, one which is intimately tied to the anthropology of history. So, paranormal noise. Electronic voice phenomena, called psicofonia in Chile, works with ambient or background noise. This noise has been described to me by Jose, a paranormal guide, as a plasticine of sorts, with which spirits confection words by some mysterious process no one can explain. This noise can come from the sound of static, such as through television screens not tuned in to any particular channel, hair dryers and other electronic apparatuses, but also through nature sounds, such as running water in rivers. The most institutionalized form of noise, however, is radio. And yesterday I watched this movie called White Noise on Netflix, which is from the 90s, and it's about a guy basically whose wife dies, and he receives messages through the screen and through radio sweeps. So, Swedish opera singer Fredrik Jürgensen, I think this is actually Raudif, but I'll get to him in a second. Swedish opera singer Fredrik Jürgensen accidentally discovered spirit voices in 1959 while he was taping bird song in a field outside Stockholm. He captured a male voice speaking in Norwegian about bird songs at night. Nori and Gailey, who are authors on this theme, say that at first he thought nothing of it. Someone had interpelled his recording, or he had picked up a stray radio broadcast. But then on further recordings, the voices emerged again and became more personal. He even heard his mother call him by his nickname. Jürgensen amassed hundreds of thousands of hours of tapes with voices, which he could only hear when played back. Konstantin Raudiv, who was this person in the photo, was another influential player in this field. A Latvian professor teaching in Uppsala in Sweden, Raudive found that radio noise was the best mediating sound to obtain voices. According to Nori and Gailey, Raudive did his own prototype of a ghost box, which is an apparatus still used today, by manually slowly moving his radio tuner dial up the broadcast band until he heard a voice say, "Now," or "make recording," or something similar. Then he turned on his tape recorder, and on playback, the voices stood out from the radio noise. The radio scan was thus popularized in paranormal investigation. The ghost box, invented by a man called Frank Sumption, which is this bizarre prototype here, is a radio sweep device that emits sounds that are fractions of seconds long. Another version is the same radio sweep without signal. Okay. Newer versions, downloadable on cell phones, do not use radio per se, but emit phonemes backwards, usually in English, but also in Parsi. So when does technology become more than a mediatory device? When does it become imminently entwined with people's cognitive and affective capacities? It becomes important in this ethnographic context to move beyond simple questions of mediation, characteristic of certain debates in anthropology of Christianity, for instance. They assume a division between the internal world of the believer and some distant transcendent, which is clearly not the case here. Rather, I will follow Aisha Belice de Jesus in her suggestion that Santeria, an Afro-Cuban religious form, be regarded as an ontology of entanglement, which is a word she borrows from Karen Barad, physicist, where techno-ritual spirits emerge and form. We need to flatten the ontological field and allow for people, technologies, and spirits to emerge from and move specific social forms. One way to do this is to regard them as forming vibrant systems of some kind, and to ask what dynamic these forms assume. These complexes of people and things create social forms and becoming that are at the same time temporal forms, variably enclosed space-times that point recursively inward. This is an idea I get from Israeli and American anthropologist Don Handel. So they point towards their own histories, forms that are generative of localized history. So each form is also a historical form, a temporal form. The paranormals I speak of here seem to be agents of time. A paranormal investigation is itself a temporal expedition of sorts, one that creates time warps, tunnels, or mediums by which what is lost, or only gauged through traces or barely heard words, or even imagined, can come to full fruition or existence in the present. And I'll give you an example. Right. Luis and Lunel Villar are brothers in their mid-30s who live in Antofagasta, which is in the north of Chile, where I interviewed them at the beginning of 2017. They hold jobs in the hotel and mining industries, but they're also experienced technicians of the apparatuses used in paranormal investigations. Luis and Lunel are the core of the Planeta Oscuro team, an amateur paranormal investigation group with several years of functioning, who specialize in recovering histories from mines that have been closed down in the north of Chile. They describe themselves as a new breed of investigators who deeply care about people and their stories, and who want to excavate the past, paranormally and otherwise, in order to conserve it in historical memory. In this section, I'll look at Planeta Oscuro's techniques for paranormal evocation in the ex-nitrates mines, okay? Mines were places of frenetic productivity, but also desolation and abandon. People lived and died in mine complexes with little healthcare until the nitrate ran out and they became ghost towns. They're also places of much suffering and abuse. So Luis and Lunel explained that the paranormal needs differences in electromagnetic frequencies in order to manifest. Some of these can be taken from participants as energy from their bodies. Apart from white noise characteristic of ghost boxes, whether apps or apparatuses, another form is to blast electromagnetic currents into the environment, for instance, with the use of EM pumps, a gyratory instrument that emits strong fields of electrical energy around it and that is thought to facilitate spirit activity. But more interestingly, Planeta Oscuro worked with what they call trigger elements, elementos desencadenantes, at each specific location of paranormal interest. These are external stimuli. They explain, for instance, if we are in a mine that was working in the 1920s, and we're in a theater in that mine that used to play Charleston music, then we're going to play Charleston songs. We may even take a couple dressed in period costumes to dance there. They sometimes play opera, other times they recite poems. If we are in a place where there was a strong presence of the army, we will play military marches. They have a fondness for one particular mine, the Chacabuco, whose bloody history during the military coup of 1973 left a mark on the whole region. After Augusto Pinochet ousted democratic elected Salvador Allende, he set up prisoner camps all over the country, including in Antofagasta, in the ex-mining complexes. Chacabuco held over 5,000 political detainees from 1973 to 1975, some of whom were tortured and some of which disappeared, taken by the military to the deserts of the province and never to be seen again. The suffering remained there, Linal says. One of the trigger elements that they used for their paranormal investigation of Chacabuco was a specific recording. There was an old theater used by miners before the military took it over, and the recording they played there was in fact recorded there. According to Linal, the singer was one of the state's detainees at the mine. This recording was made anonymously, but you can hear the applause of the crowd in the background, a crowd made up of prisoners. But what happened then was that the singer suddenly stops and you can hear an officer come in and start reading out the names of the people that are liberated. So this is a historical moment caught in the recording, which is then played again to evoke paranormal effects, right? The sort of recycling of history, of folding back of history in one spot. So Planeta Oscuro did this extraordinary recording as a trigger element to subsequently achieve registros paranormales, so paranormal registers. They also did a short documentary called Echoes of the Beyond on the history of the Chacabuco mine, with moving images and photographs of prisoners doing their daily chores to be added to the investigation clip. So he says, Luis says, one travels in time at these mines. These are cities that become stopped in time, like time capsules, but this suffering stayed. So Planeta Oscuro is also interesting because there are also amateur historians. So they dialogue with local scholars, archival material, and variegated forms of media to garner information about the sites investigated, including from the public. And in essence, in their investigations, this paper is actually an excerpt from a book that I've just submitted to Routledge on historicity and the paranormal and trauma. But what I argue in this chapter is that there's a form to these social constellations, which are also temporal constellations. And one of the things they do is that there's an interiority of this form which then torques out into the environment, and in this case, the media and the public environment, which then provides clues, information, to then reconstruct and reconfigure this interiority of the form itself. Right? So the idea of noise here is interesting because noise is an especially relevant component in this consideration because it is what connects lines of history making to lines of paranormal investigation. Noise, as a broader category of vibration, has no past, no history. It is reverberation, sonic vibration, plastic to the extreme. Through noise, we can conceive that a multiplicity of these lines can coexist at once, meaning histories can move at different speeds and with different contours simultaneously. And this is also an idea that I got from Reinhard Kostlik and other historians. Furthermore, noise is a connecting relational force, which can be seen in the dynamics of paranormal investigation, but also in terms of traumatic memory and its triggering. And it's to that I turn now, hoping that I'm still in time. Right. So in an article published at the dawn of the global pandemic crisis in American Anthropologist, Francisca Marquez writes, within just a few days, what began as a protest against an increase in the price of public transportation in Chile on October 6, 2019, became an unprecedented popular revolt against the government of President Sebastián Piñera and neoliberal policies in Chile. On Friday, October 18, 2019, the cities in Chile burned. The streets were filled with rubble. Hundreds of people crowded into the streets, banging pots and metal spoons, which saturated the nightscape like war drums. We still hear them today. People refer to these protests as estallido social, a social explosion. People say Chile has woken. So no one has remained indifferent to the social crisis that occurred and that is still occurring in Chile, the results of which have led to a promise of a referendum for a new national constitution. And in fact, that referendum already passed, and it was that people voted for a new constitution, so that was successful. Not least because of the almost immediate military and police brutality that ensued the protests and marches. One that during several months of fighting left 40 people dead, hundreds injured, and hundreds with eyes pierced by pellet guns. And this was quite mediatic and quite public, this situation with the eyesight, right? Marquez says that torture chambers are not needed for the specter of the dictatorship to be patent on every street corner. I start with this example in the section because it is blatant and it's still ongoing. It is a blatant confrontation with the past that is still an open wound, resolved neither through memorialization processes nor through economic and political reforms. Inequality is produced ipso facto from a neoliberal economic system that stratifies and privatizes what in most of the world we consider to be basic human rights. And it is still ongoing because the referendum has not happened. Well, it has happened yet. Sorry, this is something I wrote a few months ago. Mostly, well, it's still occurring, right? And it's also compounded by the health crisis that Chile is also battling, okay? But it also is also due to the fact that the conditions the protesters were marching against are still very much the same. Things haven't really changed that much. The few reforms that have been passed have been palliative, not substantial, and have created more ire and not respite. But there's a clear overlap of historical resonances, both at an individual and collective level, that is happening in this very moment in time, which is why it is important to analyze it here, even if only briefly. These resonances are both sonic, read as trauma relived through sounds, and affective, read as bodily forms of carrying history and socializing it transgenerationally. One of my students in my medical anthropology class commented that whenever she went out to march or protest in 2019 and 2020, usually in central Santiago around Plaza La Dignidad, her grandfather would fall into a state of desperate anxiety. The first few days of the estallido brought it all back. There were tanks parading threateningly on Santiago's main arteries, which is something as a citizen of Portugal I've never seen, and it was terrifying. The army was deployed to the streets, the smell of tear gas, the sound of bullets tearing through the air. All of these things occurred and were palpable and audible. Stories quickly emerged on social media of violations of human rights in the context of arrests or in detention centers where some protesters were taken. Women raped, the elderly beaten, the young on the streets, irremediably scarred, damaged. By November, the United Nations had sent a team of observers who rightly condemned the government's response in a sharp and powerful statement. So they said, we have found that the overall management of assemblies by police was carried out in a fundamentally repressive manner, was what the UN mission team leader said.
Diana, there are 5 minutes remaining.
Thanks. But this went deeper. The government's handling of the protesters hit a chord that went back to the abuses of 1973 and thereafter. Right? This was a transgenerational chord, one whose dissonance is lodged in people's bodies, if not explicit memories. For instance, Nancy Nichols Lopeandia describes how hearing became essential for children of the dictatorship, right? They would overhear their parents or the other adults speaking of human rights violations, deaths, and bodies thrown in the Mapocho, the river in Santiago. She says, at night, the children would hear the sounds of gunshots, the sound of the military passing through the city's roads, the sound of airplanes and helicopters, and added to that, the imagination. You would hear, you wouldn't see, concealment to protect. Nichols works precisely in the domain of the auditory, particularly in popular low-class neighborhoods in Santiago, with children of that era. She says that the process of concealment by adults was similar here to in upper-class neighborhoods. Jenny, an interlocutor of Nichols, says that her father would cover her face to protect her from atrocities. But for most of the children interviewed, the threat of violence and the state of fear this provoked were concrete experiences. So she describes the memories of Andrea, a woman who grew up in a left-leaning family who lived in an upper-class neighborhood. Andrea had a happy childhood, but she remembers clearly hearing the bombings of the presidential residence in Las Condes, called Tomás Moro, after the street where it was at, before the military went on to destroy La Moneda and presumably assassinate Allende. She remembers the anguish of her parents due to the disappearance and arrest of many of her friends, and she was overwhelmed by the silence when she found out that others at school did not think like her and her family. So she could not speak freely in the supermarket. When she began to sing a communist song, her mother would hush her. So Nichols argues that the experiences that emerged in this series of events, powerfully felt by children, were born from the regime's intention to evoke a psychological climate of fear and anxiety. And it is a collective fear, a threat that arises from the deployment of dictatorial regimes' apparatus of state security. And this is still operative, okay? So there has been plenty of work on the generational transferability of trauma in the Chilean context, right? And it is unsurprising that most of it has been written by psychologists and therapists. And I'm not an expert on this because I'm not a psychologist, but just to note that places of intense suffering demand the conceptualization of the body as a collective, as extending beyond itself. And there's the clear example of Julia Dixon Gomez on Salvadorian trauma. So she has this article called The Sound of Barking Dogs, which is very good, and in which she sees PTSD as something not just individual, but collective, as something which is transferred, indeed, from not just from parents to children, but also even to grandchildren, right? So, in effect, I am finishing. Others that have explored this perspective of the third generation in relation to the military dictatorship have been some psychologists also connected to La Católica, where I work, who argue that their interlocutors, the children, construct the narratives of their suffering endured by their grandparents in highly emotional ways. So because there was a silencing and an absolute censura of information, these children don't have much to go on. So their memories of what may have happened are extremely effective in nature, okay? So in an obvious sense, and I'm concluding here, Founders, Bracaler and Cornejo, the authors of this paper that I just mentioned, their interlocutors are producing microhistories in real time. So ever-presentists, their only source of connection to what happened 40 years earlier is through fragments, colored, intensified by affective dispositions and emotional content. But these are the same fragments that reverberate in the young protesters of 2019 and 2020. The same anger and resentment that have festered underneath a peaceful neoliberal surface in mostly silence that now boils up to the surface, triggered by existing conditions in the state's response to their plea. So this leads to confrontation, rage, bullets, wounds, and death. And one of the questions that could be asked by way of conclusion is whether this third generation is not finally reliving the trauma of their grandparents firsthand in a slightly different context, or very different context. The noise of these violations, or of the violence of profound equality, and of the brutality of the state's repression in the estallido social has been a constant since 1973. So as the protesters say, it's not 30 pesos, no son 30 pesos. They say, referring to the price hike of the public transport system. It's 30 years, son 30 años. And they might as well have said in 2020, son 47 años, it's 47 years. So this is how I make the link between these two eras. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana, for the presentation. I'm sure there will be quite some questions on this topic. We will be expecting you back when you can. We'll save those questions for you. So the next presentation would be by Edgar Cabanas from Universidad Camilo José Cela in Spain. And the title is Positive Education, the new spin towards therapeutic culture. So I'll give the word over to you. You need to activate the microphone. I'm just sorry. One thing, I forgot to tell them that I ask you to mute yourselves during the presentation of others to avoid interferences with ambiental noise. So that's okay. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first off, I would like to thank Mariano Plotkin and Daniel Nering for their kind invitation to this wonderful conference. And I'm also very glad to see here some friends like Rodrigo. Hello. I'm going to stick to the time limit. I tailored my presentation just to fit into 15-20 minutes. So I'll try to be as fast as possible. I'm going to share my my screen. Let me check if I can do it. Okay.
As long as you stay within the 25 minutes, we're fine.
Okay, let's see if I succeeded. What do you see? Do you see my presentation?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. So mainly, the main idea of the presentation, I'm going to talk about positive education. I hope that you're familiar with it. I won't be able to explain it in detail, but the main idea is that positive education is the introduction of positive psychology's ideas into the field of education. Positive psychology, also called the science of happiness, for those who you don't know it. But anyway, if you want more details about it, I can give them to you in the discussion. Okay. Well, the main ideas I'm going to speak about here are two. The first one is that positive education is bad science, and the second one is that is a strongly ideological movement. So what I'm going to try to show is those both arguments. This work is based on a larger research. Here I'm going to just give you some hints or some examples of it, because I won't be able to explain it much longer. So let me go straight to the introduction of the talk, and let me explain you a little bit about this movement of positive education, because in the last decade, well, education worldwide has undergone a substantial happiness turn, according to which cultivating happiness and well-being in children and adolescents have become a top priority among parents, teachers, and other educational agents around the world. Some people have seen this happiness turn in education as a much needed revolution that will solve the most pressing psychological and educational problems in schools, including, of course, academic underachievement. Other people, though, have seen this happiness turn as little more than the latest in a very long line of psychological fads, as well as nothing but another step forward towards neoliberal education. Be that as it may, critics and supporters agree that the presence of positive education has grown exponentially in the last few decades, becoming a very momentous movement within positive psychology and educational science. Positive education aims at promoting what they call skills for happiness to school-age children and adolescents, and works on the main idea, on the precept that, well, promoting emotional well-being among adolescents and children is not only a desirable goal in itself, but also an essential path to, for example, mental illness prevention, to better learning, or to greater academic success. In addition to a growing body of academic publication, this idea has led to the emergence of an increasing number of non-profit organizations, think tanks, consulting companies, associations of different kinds, private schools and colleagues, international networks. Some of you might be familiar with this big international positive education network around the world. And all these institutions call policymakers worldwide to implement positive education in their respective national educational systems. And as a data, as late as 2018, more than 17 countries have already joined positive education initiatives, including, Chile, China, the United Arab Emirates, India, Israel, and of course, countries like Australia, United Kingdom, or the US, and Spain as well. So parallel to the mounting interest in positive education, a rising tide of scientific literature have challenged both the validity and efficacy of some of the movement, and as well as of some of the highest profile constructs of this movement, like, for example, constructs or concepts like optimism, resilience, mindfulness, growth mindset, emotional intelligence, positive character strengths, and many of them that some of you might be familiar with. And they have also challenged the idea that positive education brings benefits, actual benefits of any kind for students' learning, mental health, and school performance. So, whereas positive education interventions are often, very often, justified on the ground that they provide the resources essential for educational success, there is actually no robust evidence that any of these interventions actually work towards raising educational standards. About this, numerous critical reviews, reports, and meta-analyses point out severe limitations and problems with the movement. These limitations include for example, theoretical methodological shortfalls, lack of replicability and comparative studies, absolutely lack of novelty of any kind, insufficient empirical evidence, weak and even counterproductive outcomes, and so on. Other studies, less focused on the technical side of the critique and more focused on the, let's say, cultural, social side of the critique, emphasize the strong individualistic and ideological biases of positive education. Also have pointed out the strong alignment of this movement with entrepreneurial values. And they have also drawn attention to the obsessive concern with the inner world and the psychological vulnerability that this new, we can call, spin towards therapeutic education will instill in students. Cristina Brunilla, by the way, has talked a little bit about these consequences in her conference. So I won't go in deep in this idea, just because I don't want to repeat, for example, things that she has said already. In this talk, so I will briefly comment upon some of the most important critical evidence against the movement, and I will also comment upon these ideological biases and pernicious consequences related to the movement that I have just mentioned. Very briefly, regarding the scientific limitations of positive education, well, my research team and I have conducted an extensive literature review on the topic, and we have identified well, at least two different and interrelated clusters of problems. There are more problems, but here I will only mention these two. The first one is, we can call it conceptual deficiencies and the contextualized nature of the field. And the second one, we can call it methodological and empirical shortfalls. Let me go first with the scientific limitations very quickly. About them, well, Alastair Miller pointed out that research evidence, however voluminous, is only as good as the assumptions underlying the concepts, the terms, and the relationships being tested. So, and in this regard, the problem with positive education is not only that it's rather inconsistent on a theoretical level. This problem goes actually beyond the highly nebulous and heterogeneous nature of the field, but extensively affects its high-profile concepts as well. Let me, for example, here focus on two high-profile constructs as a way of illustration: mindfulness and emotional intelligence, that you might, I'm sure that you have heard about. Regarding the former, mindfulness, well, the plethora of meanings and the lack of consensus around this concept of mindfulness has been extensively analyzed by many authors, for example, recently by Van Damme and colleagues, who have warned about the current confusion and the manifold interpretations of the term. As they say, there is neither one universally accepted technical definition of mindfulness, nor any broad agreement about detailed aspects of the underlying concept to which it refers. These authors also warn about the consequences of the semantic ambiguity for empirical and clinical studies of mindfulness, including insufficient construct validity and difficulties in operationalizing and measuring the concept. And about, by the way, all these references you can see in the PowerPoint. I have available, so if you're interested, I can send them to you. And about the emotional intelligence is also another good example where a clear definition has so far been eluded. In their extensive review of the concept, for example, Matthews and colleagues argue that there is no clear consensual definition of emotional intelligence. And these authors also stress that the multitude of qualities covered by the concept at times, I quote, can appear overwhelming. The range and scope of definitions that currently exist within the literature make inevitable, comparisons between the science of emotional intelligence and the allegory of underlying the Tower of Babel. Indeed, the authors identified at least 8 different conceptualizations of emotional intelligence that also differ between authors, approaches, and assessment techniques. In this regard, other studies have concluded that emotional intelligence is a term, I quote, bereft of any conceptual meaning. A problem that still seems to be far from being overcome today, and that severely affects any intervention based on the concept. I will talk about it subsequently. But besides conceptual concerns, other authors have warned about the decontextualized nature of the field. For example, Ciarocci and colleagues have pointed out that the vast majority of positive education interventions are what they call content-focused instead of context-focused. This means that positive education interventions generally presume that, well, increasing positive mental health and emotional content, whatever it means, and diminishing negativity is inherently good, regardless of the content. Following these authors, positive education will suffer from 3 substantial problems that have so far gone unsolved. The first one is that interventions based on these movements are too often presented as universal and individual-oriented solutions for a vast myriad of challenges within education, for example, from academic underachievement and disengagement to mental illness or bullying and so on. Thus, ignoring critical external factors that actually contribute to explaining dysfunctional behavior, and instead frame problems as deficiencies of students themselves. Such a view then not only overestimates the idea that causes reside within the individual and underestimates the power of the context, but would also prompt students to blame themselves for their difficulties. A second problem pointed out is the tendency of positive education interventions to disregard the importance of negative thoughts and feelings, and minimizing the role of unpleasant experiences, the authors claim, risk positive education interventions being misguided and even being detrimental in terms of mental health prevention, just the contrary of what they want to achieve. And the third problem considered, for example, by other authors, is that these interventions might set unrealistic expectations, which paradoxically could undermine well-being and lead to disappointment, hence also, again, producing the very opposite effects that these interventions aim to achieve. Let me just talk a bit about the methodological and empirical shortfalls, because regarding this, the movement has also been challenged from wide-ranging reports and meta-analysis to replication studies and empirical examinations. There is a growing critical literature suggesting that positive education does not meet the minimum scientific standards, which is of particular importance for a movement whose educational relevance is claimed on its alleged scientific robustness and accomplishment of gold scientific standards. For example, in a recent meta-analysis conducted on the field, Waters and Lawton stressed that only 29% of positive education studies include proper experimental designs, that only 13% of positive constructs have been studied 10 or more times, or they conclude that the cumulative evidence needed to establish the generalizability of many positive education interventions is still missing. Just remember that the idea of positive education is to be implemented all over the world. Let me again take mindfulness and emotional intelligence as illustrative examples. Regarding mindfulness, the efficacy of mindfulness-based interventions has also been challenged by studies claiming that the widespread use of the concept in educational practice is, in the best case scenario, premature. If only because these interventions have so far been insufficiently tested. Only 30% of research using mindfulness-based interventions have moved beyond pilot stages. Barely 9% of research include active control groups, and roughly 1% of all research has been conducted outside research context. These problems have also been emphasized by Kalapiran and colleagues, whose meta-analysis concluded that only 1/3 of the reviewed mindfulness studies were rated as poor quality, and also claiming, for example, that overall results found were heterogeneous and that they found considerable publication biases in these studies. And for its part, the efficacy of emotional intelligence has also been put into question by several meta-analyses suggesting a very modest impact on educational outcomes. For example, very recently, Gon and Zhao found that the effect sizes of emotional intelligence studies in the last 2 decades appear not only to be highly heterogeneous and generally modest, as happens with other concepts, but also that the effect sizes of all these studies reviewed have significantly decreased over the last 20 years. According to these authors, the explanation for this decline, weird decline, is that the effect sizes in many studies have been overestimated. Well, however, scientific weaknesses are not the only, I would say, not even the most important and concerning challenges raised against positive education. A great deal of criticism has also been raised against the movement's ideological biases and assumptions. I have developed elsewhere that positive education should be viewed as symptomatic of a long-standing tradition of therapeutic pedagogies built upon the firm belief that psychological factors are more fundamental facilitators or barriers to school achievement than, for example, sociological or contextual ones. This belief has actually sustained numerous and ambitious, but definitely unsuccessful movements over the course of the last decades. Such is the case, for example, of the self-esteem movement in the 90s and in the 80s and 90s. This movement deeply rooted in the conviction that there is a strong connection between self-reliance and life success. The movement nevertheless proved to be a resounding failure. In this regard, the self-esteem movement is indeed a good example of how cultural and ideological artifacts often play a leading role, not only in sustaining certain psychological premises and social interventions, despite the strong evidence against them, but also in motivating certain kinds of psychological research and interventions in the first place. And positive education, just very similar to what happened with the self-esteem movement, is no exception. On the contrary, behind positive education lurks an individualistic ideology that neglects upfront the role of socioeconomic and other contextual and structural factors in learning and achievement. It is worth mentioning that this individualism underlying positive education has not only been underlined by critics, but also by some positive psychologists themselves. A recent study conducted by Trasker and colleagues actually showed that 88% of the students who had gone through a positive education program interpreted success and prosperity in individual rather than collective terms, in contrast with the 35% of the comparison group students who were much more likely to invoke economic, political, and social equality issues.
Edgar, 5 minutes.
Indeed, if we were to point out the single most characteristic feature of positive education, this will be its tendency to play down or to disregard the importance, as I said, of contextual structural factors when it comes to education. As I have developed elsewhere, positive education's commitment to educational improvement exclusively through the enhancement of individual well-being builds on an individualistic approach to education that, for example, neglects pressing and fundamental issues of a structural and social character. For example, the issues of multiculturalism and social exclusion in schools, the growing educational gap between rich and poor, the increasing economic cost of accessing higher education for a large part of the population, or the declining investment in study grants and quality state school and colleges. But such omissions do not merely signal the underlying individualism and reductionism of the movement. They can also distort research and intervention outcomes by introducing a self-confirmatory bias. In this regard, for example, Gord and colleagues point out that the discrete positive association generally found between concepts like expectations, self-esteem, self-control, optimism, and other educational outcomes, I quote, tend to disappear when high-quality contextual data is available. The overlapping between scientific limitations and ideological biases is well summarized in Ferredi's observation that one reason why so much of educational research has yielded so little insight is because it is not disinterested research. So one might wonder why positive education has so powerfully and rapidly made it into educational policies all around the globe. All the more so when one considers that the evidence in favor is clearly weak, to say the least. I would say that education is too valuable to introduce concepts, interventions, and programs built on inconclusive and mixed evidence at best. But nonetheless, it is not just a matter of proof of evidence, as I said, irrespective of how strong or weak positive education interventions might be in scientific terms. It will also be necessary that the field, for example, fields like this come clean about the ideological assumptions underlying the movement, as well as that the field takes responsibility for the kind of educational changes that it aims to implement. And about this point, Cristina Brunilla said something in her presentation, as I mentioned before. So I will conclude by highlighting two main points for debate. First, that leading an educational change on an insufficient scientific basis seems just as wrong as disregarding the ideological assumptions that guide these changes or that motivate them in the first place. And second, that what education worldwide needs might not be more therapy or a better therapy, but more resources and a better pedagogy. And movements like positive education might not add to education anything but more of the former and not necessarily of a better kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Interestingly, strong connections are emerging with Cristina Brunilla's presentation, who already sent a comment by the chat, which we will take up session. Thank you. So let's move on to the third presentation by Mauro Pasqualini from CONICET, IDES, and the title of his presentation is Between the Unconscious and the People, Latin American Intellectuals in the Crossroads Between Psychoanalysis and Politics. So, Mauro,
thank you very much, Piro. Thank you very much. The problem is that I'm not seeing you right now, and I'm not sure if you can see my screen or my PowerPoint. In fact, I don't even know if you are listening to me.
We can see you. The PowerPoint has not come through yet. Try presenting it. Maybe it just takes a little while. In case you're having difficulties, maybe you might have to disable your video transmission. As much as we would like to see
my PowerPoint,
face, but
no, we don't, Mauro.
Well, don't worry. I can. So I will be talking about my. Yes.
Una question. Maybe you want to disable the video now because it's starting now. The presentation it just takes some time. It's fine. It's fine.
Ahora se ve.
Right. Perfect.
Okay.
No problem at all then. Okay, well, thank you very much, Piro, for your presentation, and thank you very much for everybody to meeting me to this Congress or reunion. As Piro said, my name is Mauro Pasqualini, and I'm a historian, and I work on the history of psychoanalysis, especially in Italy during the 20th century, of course. But I am also interested in the connection between psychoanalysis and social theory. In fact, during the last years, I've been teaching a seminar in a master degree programs among psychoanalysts on the connection precisely on psychoanalysis and social theory. For this meeting, I brought to you a paper on three authors, which I am interested in exploring, which has to do with a specific kind of connection between psychoanalysis and politics in what I understand is a specific Latin American context. If you can see my PowerPoint, you will see now the three authors I am talking about are very heterogeneous ones. I'm talking about Ernesto Lakla, Jorge Aleman, and David Pavón de Cuésar. Maybe some of you know some names in this list. Ernesto Lakla is very well known. He was a historian also, but mainly a political theorist. He died a few years ago, and he was mainly an academic, a man of the university. Jorge Aleman is a very different case, even when they share a lot of assumptions and a lot of experiences together, because he's a psychoanalyst, he's younger, and he is part of an interesting process, an interesting cultural process happening in the 70s and 80s, which has to do with the psychoanalytic diaspora from Argentina to Spain. After the 1976 dictatorship, many psychoanalysts moved to Spain, and well, it's something which has been studied by many historians of psychoanalysis. And finally, the youngest one is David Pavón de Cuésar, who is a Mexican psychoanalyst, although he studied in Spain, but now he teaches philosophy and psychology in Mexico. I am focusing on these authors as part of a longer history of psychoanalysis and politics, and there's an incredibly rich history of authors who have tried to cross the line dividing the clinical practice and politics. And if we had to make a list of these names, we would mention the Freudio-Marxist like Wilhelm Reich, Erich Fromm, Harold Marcuse, then later in the century, Louis Althusser, and most recently, Judith Butler, who from queer theory or from her research and interest in gender and sexuality is constantly dealing with psychoanalysis. But of course, if we talk about psychoanalysis and politics, the name and the main figure is of course Slavoj Žižek, who I assume you all know very well. From the point of view of the historians of psychoanalysis, the relationship to politics has been approached from many different angles, even contrasting ones. A very classic interpretation is the one promoted by Karl Schorsky, a historian of Central European culture, but who has interesting insights on psychoanalysis. And his point was that psychoanalysis and politics are extremely diverse, to the point that psychoanalysis for him was born out of Freud's rejection of politics. I'm not going too deep into his interpretation, but for him, the fact is that when Freud created psychoanalysis, he was part of the cultural world of irrationality, who was precisely breaking with the tradition of rational liberals proper of the generation before Freud. On the other extreme, we have authors like Eli Zaretsky or Stephen Frosch, who promote an idea of psychoanalysis as intrinsically progressive. For them, psychoanalysis has a critical and emancipatory dimension. And talking about psychoanalysis and politics, it's like talking about critical or progressive liberalism. And then we have the most recent research by Dagmar Herzog, who published a book some years ago about whole world Freud. And in that book, she says that we shouldn't approach a prioristically on the relationship between psychoanalysis and politics, but go case by case and study different contexts. So one thing is the Weimar years in Berlin or in Germany during the 20s or 30s. And another thing is the second post-war in the US, where psychoanalysts became more conservative, or we can talk about the relationship between psychoanalysts and the Latin American dictatorships of during the 60s. So there are different contexts which frame different kind of responses. It is in this spirit that I am studying and I'm working on these authors, And I do believe that they have to do with a specific Latin American context. But if you are watching my PowerPoint, you will see that I put between commas Latin American because, well, this is of course a construction, because to what extent they are Latin American authors can be subject to interpretation, because for instance, their biographies, well, of course, they were all born in Latin America, but people such as Ernesto Lakla lived most of his life in the UK as an academic, and also people like Jorge Aleman, who lives in Spain. But I do believe that the Latin American issue here has a lot to do with their audiences. I think most of the public, for people at least like Jorge Aleman or David Pavón, are precisely in Latin America. And I do believe that certain optimism towards politics, which unifies all of them, has to do with a specific Latin American thing. And of course, I am making these points just to be discussed later in case it occurs. To put all these authors together, of course, is a construction, since there are a lot of differences between them or among them. They have different backgrounds. Lakla was a historian and a political theorist, as I said before, whereas Aleman and Pavón de Cuéllar are psychoanalysts. Their transnational itineraries are very different. Lakla emigrated to the UK and lived there and taught in the Essex University, although he toured a lot around universities in the US. But he was basically a man of the academy. Even when he has an important political projection. Aleman instead is part, as I said before, of the Argentinian psychoanalytic diaspora, but he is part of this culture or this sociability of Lacanian psychoanalyst in Spain, and most of his work and of his activity takes place in the Lacanian Association in Spain. Pavón de Cuéllar, on the other hand, is also part of the Spanish-Mexican itinerary. He had a degree in Spain, but he now teaches in Mexico. But his connection or his affiliation has to do with an English group created by a psychologist called Ian Parker, who are Marxist Lacanian. And well, as I said before, their affiliations are also very different. Lakla is a man of the academy, Aleman is part of the Lacanian Spanish groups, and Pavón de Cuéllar is part of the Mexican academy, but also part of this English group. Now, those are the differences, but what do they have in common? Well, basically, they all try to make a mix or to make a formula, trying to put together Lacan and Marx, or Lacan and the left-wing tradition of thought. They all share that they try to deal with what I would call the post-constellation. And at some moments during the 1980s, in the world of theory and the culture sensitivities, experienced a series of post-things: post-structuralism, post-modernism, post-Marxism. Well, the authors I'm bringing you today, they all cope with that in different fashions, but what unifies all of them is that coming from a left-wing tradition, they try to integrate that post-constellation within their minds. And this also applies for the many ends in which people incur during the last decades: the end of master narratives, the end of a unified subject, the end of history. Well, they try to incorporate those perceptions and sensitivities into their left-wing allegiances. And the crucial feature is that all of them try to accommodate to this new sensitivity by celebrating the political. And something that all of them share, even with nuances, is that for all of them, politics emerges out of the impossible closure of society. Politics can be considered as deeply opposed to technocracy and the administration of things, And politics is not an instrument to achieve a goal. Politics, in fact, is not like in the old times of perhaps other experiences. It's not about changing society or bringing change or helping the underdogs or trying to bring an end to social inequality. On the contrary, politics is about several changes in the way people symbolizes things. And politics then has a lot to do with contingency and with the notion that politics starts when universality fails. It is when we stop sharing one version of things that then there's an openness to the political. And they are all happy with very current notions today, which has to do with the fact that politics is a performative action, and politics and antagonism or an agonistic notion of politics is something they all have in common. And they all are also very inclined to incorporate notions like event and decision into the modes in which they refer to politics. There are long traditions of thought regarding this, but most of them don't come from left-wing thought, but through mediating Marxism and psychoanalysis, they all incorporated these notions into their perspectives. Now, after this general presentation, I could make a short description of more or less how they dealt with these issues. In this sense, the forerunner, the first person that I detect to make an important connection between Lacan or Lacanianism and the left-wing tradition of thought is Ernesto Lakla. Ernesto Lakla, before his last, or already in his very earlier books, especially in a book from 1977 called Ideology and Politics in Marxist Theory, was calling the attention on the fact that Marxism had a problem to think about politics because of its economic determinism, and that Marxism had to deal with the fact that social identities are not careers of interest generated in the realm of economic production. By contrast, identities and social relations are established by articulatory practices that provide stability and intelligibility to social life. By doing this, he was making, well, a reading of the Marxist tradition and finding out something which was, of course, very well known, which is that the communist or Marxist theoretician Antonio Gramsci was the most sophisticated one in terms of analyzing politics. But his argument was that Gramsci's notion of hegemony had to introduce a break into the notion of social objectivity, which is still strong in the Marxist tradition. And in order to do that, theoreticians had to open up to a brand new current of influences coming from Heidegger, Derrida, Wittgenstein, and of course, in crucial for my purposes here, Lacan and the Lacanian tradition or the Lacanian authors. In fact, one of the crucial points in Laclau's perspective was that one of the ideas that Marxists had to get rid of was the idea of totality, and the idea that there can be a closed totality fixing meanings in a determinate and eternal mode. In contrast to that, he incorporated a series of notions coming from Lacan and from Jacques-Alain Miller, who's an important name within the Lacanian tradition, which had to do with notions like sutures, nodal points, or floating signifiers. And these notions help Lakla to explain that meanings and identities are fixed according to how privileged sites within society works to endow meaning to different experiences and practices. He was taking many things from basically or fundamentally from Lacanian notions of psychosis, where, well, there were always special or privileged signifiers which were the one that prevented the constant slippage of the chain of signifiers. This is, of course, very abstract and very remote, but the idea was that this tradition or this conceptualization from Lacan were useful for Lakla in order to bring about a non-deterministic notion or a more politically oriented notion into Marxism. The point is that one of the fundamental books by Lakla was a book in the 1980s, which had a strong impact, which was called Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. And in that book, he developed all these things in theoretical terms, as I said before, but there was an important practical and political issue there because he was very interested in incorporating all the politics coming from the social movements into the tradition of the left. So his point was that the single issues could be incorporated into a unified political movement by establishing chains of equivalencies. And in order to establish equivalencies, a crucial notion by Lakla was the notion of antagonism. Antagonism is precisely the way one can unify different claims or different demands and different identities into a single political identity. The important point here is that that comes from politics. It's not just economic determinants that are going to the job for politicians. Later on, some 20 years later, Lakla reappeared with a new book in which he addresses another crucial issue of the moment. In this moment, it was not anymore to talk about social movements, but to incur or to participate in a conversation going on both in theory and in practical politics about the notion of populism. And he jumped into the discussion by a very strong argument. His point was that populism was not a pathology of politics. We shouldn't approach it as something deviant. But on the contrary, populism is an extreme case that reveals the logic of the political. According to him, populism was always referred to in the denigratory terms of extremely rhetorical, over-affective, demagogic, as inconsistent in ideological terms. And his point was that, well, antagonism, rhetorics, and performativity are crucial issues of all kinds of politics. So to transfer that to populism, it's not an intelligent move. And in order to argue or to make his point, he coined a very important notion by himself. Some people believe it was already in Lacan, and there's a lot of Lacanian influence in this, but the notion of empty signifiers is an elaboration by Lakla. And basically, the empty signifiers is a strong or extreme version of the synecdotic logic in all politics or in all hegemony. Politics and hegemony is about the part embodying the whole, or the part taking the place of the totality. And according to him, all politics is about that. And empty signifiers are specific symbols, identities, or demands that replace that empty their particularity in order to incarnate plenitude, or the idea that the social is being reconciliated with itself. Empty signifiers are constituted by a radical investment, and when the radical investment, it's a very strong emotional affection and a very strong affective dimension into these symbols. And whenever we study, or whenever Lakla deepens into his study of this affective dimension, he uses the notion of the object aid by Lacan. They are objects that receive a surplus of enjoyment by embodying an absent plenitude. Well, we can talk about a lot about this, but my interest here is to make the point of how in deepening his notion of populism, Lakla became much more connected to Lacanian influences, even when he had them before, but they were more discrete. The late Lakla, in contrast, I think, was more open to incorporating explicitly Lacanian influences.
Mauro, there are 5 minutes remaining.
Okay, well, then we have my second author here is Jorge Aleman. Maybe he's the most interesting in terms of how he's relevant for understanding the communities or the audiences in Latin America that celebrate this connection between psychoanalysis and the left. In order to portray his influence, just let me give you an anecdote, or let me tell you about an anecdote. This weekend, the daily journal Página 12 brought a booklet by Jorge Aleman on ideology. So since I was working on Jorge Aleman, I ran into the kiosk to buy the journal along with the booklet, and I found out that the booklet was so loud. So I had to buy only the newspaper. But this gives you an idea of the audience of Jorge Aleman. If we relate with, if we compare him with people such as Gabriel Rolón, he's going to be much less influential. He's not as massive as Gabriel Rolón. But we could define that people who read Página 12 and are interested in psychology could be perfectly match the kind of audience Jorge Aleman addresses. The point is that Jorge Aleman is definitely a Lacanian jumping into politics, but he's interested in observing how empty signifiers are, of course, important, but he uses a lot the notion of basically the idea of the master signifiers by Lacan. His point is that master signifiers are very powerful in terms of how they shape subjectivity and how all notions of the superego or authority and repression are being replaced by how people constitute their subjectivity according to how they internalize mandates and imperatives coming from the consumerism and the private sphere and market pressures. Of course, he has said a lot and worked a lot against neoliberalism, which for him it's a mode of producing subjectivity, and to make subjects or producing identities easy to manage, to become manageable, and to become administered by corporations and by imperative coming from marketplace. The important point to him, and for the points I want to make here, is that his contempt against neoliberalism has not so much to do with promoting consumerism, but with the notion that neoliberalism has to do with getting rid of politics. And getting rid of politics means for Jorge Aleman precisely erasing the precariousness that has to do with how we make sense of our reality. So the point of neoliberalism is its strong assertion of what is given in our immediate experience, and not to realize that our immediate experience is basically produced by different processes by which we make sense of reality. And finally, we have this Mexican author, Pavón de Cuéllar, and for him, he differs from the two previous authors in that he has a toughest and strongest notion of Marxism to incorporate within the Lacanian tradition. In fact, he is very interested in making the point that for him what is important is to found or to create a Lacanian Marxism, where the point is that Marxism will be the crucial issue in bridging the gap between psychoanalysis and politics. This differs with, for instance, Jorge Aleman. For him, the idea was to create a Lacanian left, and the Lacanian left for Aleman would be a cultural place to elaborate the mourning process from the uncertainties of the left. Pavón de Cuéllar is still strongly attached to some certainties from the left. So for him, the crucial point is to make an identity, a political identity where Marxism is still powerful. And then he deals a lot with notion of unconscious, the other, and the real, but emphasizing the fact that for Lacan, all these notions are not psychological, inner worldly or inner mental conceptions, but they are interpersonal realities. They are much out of the social interaction. And well, we can deal more later about his details or the details of his thought, but in order to be respectful of the time here, I would like to jump into some conclusions and new questions. As I said before, I am still working on how to frame these authors. My first approach is that they constitute one more case in the long history of psychoanalysis and politics, and I definitely believe that the Latin American context has a lot to do with them. But then I still have to explore two different issues. One is what does these authors tell us about the psychoanalytic profession these days? What can we conclude about what is going on with the profession of psychoanalysis based on these authors? What does it tell us about psychoanalytic sociability these days? And maybe the notion of profession to refer to psychoanalysis is not a good one. Maybe I should talk more about psychoanalytic sociabilities, psychoanalytic cultures, or the kind of communities that are built around psychoanalysis, and how can they deal with the new issues coming from pressures in technocratic, what they would call technocratic pressures within the world of mental health. So that's why I am interested in exploring these experiences, not just for the contents of their reflection, but also for what they tell us about what is going on today in the world of psychoanalysis. And in order to put this together with the main aim of this Congress, I still have to work on how the notion of therapeutic cultures work in order to understand these experiences. I think that one specific response to, they can be considered as one specific response to the spread of therapeutic cultures. And while we can see how many people or many experiences try to incorporate notions from Umbanda or New Age or popular culture or magic or many dimensions to construct specific modes of therapeutic culture, maybe these experiences, these authors that I am exploring here, can help us to see that a very specific therapeutic culture emerging from this psychoanalytic world has to do with incorporating politics or reframing politics in a new mode, incorporating ideas about antagonism and performativity, but also trying to move away from extremely technocratic or scientific notion of the profession and trying to understand better how the professional and politics interact. And so thank you very much for your time and your interest. And with these words, I put an end to my presentation.
Thank you very much, Mauro, for the presentation. Definitely, there will be questions and comments on this hot topic. Now, let's move on to the final presentation of this panel. A three-way collaboration between Mariano Plotkin from CONICET, IDES, Universidad Nacional de 3 de Febrero, Nicolás Viotti from Flaxo y Universidad Nacional de San Martín, y myself. It will be presented, well, first Mariano will say a couple of words, then the presentation will be in the hands of Nicolás. So I'll give the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I will be extremely brief because I want to Nicolás to have a chance to present our work. I just wanted to point out that this, what Nicolás is going about to say, is part of a book-length project that Piroshka, Nicolás, and I am putting together, in which we compare the construction of therapeutic, what we call therapeutic networks, in Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires. It's a comparative. It's not exactly a comparative work. It's a work in which we try to focus on different aspects of both cities, and it's based on both qualitative and quantitative sources. We have carried out a poll in the two cities, which over 800 cases each, And also we conducted over 40 interviews, in-depth interviews in both cities. And the only thing I want to say to end this is that we consider therapeutics in the broadest possible sense, going, let's say, from Umbanda to Freud. And well, I prefer Nicolas to go ahead and explain the case.
I have to switch it on. Okay, do you hear me well? Yes? Well, as Mariano said, this kind of paper is just a part of the larger book. In fact, it's a part of the last chapter. And it's a story of a woman called Adriana that with Mariano and Pirosca, we found it that it could be interesting to describe a little bit of this case as an example of a hybrid therapeutic network. So I'm going to read it. I think we don't have images to show, so sorry, you have to hear me. It is generally accepted that modernity introduced a conceptualization of reality organized around a series of polarities associated to dualist thinking. Modernity tradition, human, non-human, nature, culture, practical, scientific knowledge, etc. However, the phenomenon of the proliferation of hybrids that Bruno Latour examines runs counter to the binary oppositions, and he posits the emergence of such hybrids as the result of the activity of a particular kind of actor, the mediator. Thus, instead of considering therapeutic networks as more or less stable and homogeneous conglomerates of ideas and practices that fluctuate between a modern pole and a traditional one, a scientific and a religious one, in this paper, we focus our attention on what is produced in the space in between. There is an ongoing debate among anthropologists and social scientists in general between those who focus on ontological distinctions and those who think that ontology is just another word for culture. What is at stake in this discussion is a crucial question: how to conceptualize difference. Is it the product of different forms of interpreting a single really existent reality, or are they different realities altogether? Throughout this paper, without ignoring the importance of these questions, we shall not take sides in this debate, because we believe that doing so would bring us back to the kind of dualism ontology that we try to leave behind. Instead, we prefer to keep clear from making such distinctions by leaving the answer to our actors. When we distinguish here between ontology and culture, we do it on the basis of considering folk characterization of the single or multiple words our actors inhabit. In other words, we take an agnostic attitude regarding the nature of diversity. We just follow our informants' narratives. To put it simply, instead of defining ourselves the nature of what is mediated, we take our informants' implicit or explicit conceptualizations as our standard. In what follows, we will focus on Adriana, one of our interviewees, whose trajectory and therapeutic assemblage put in evidence, probably better than any other case, the very notion of hybridity. Adriana is a psychologist in her mid-40s, working on her PhD dissertation. She was born in Pernambuco, northeastern Brazil. However, her family moved to the state of Rio de Janeiro when she grew up. Her first approach to Afro-Brazilian culture came through capoeira, an Afro-Brazilian martial art that combines dance, music, and acrobatics. Around 2003, when she was working in a favela, Adriana became deeply impressed by the ability of a capoeira teacher to take addict children out of drugs. Therefore, what captured her attention from the Afro-Brazilian practice at that particular point was its social dimension, rather than its spiritual one. For reasons that we will discuss soon, Adriana reflects on her role as an ontological hybridizer and a cultural mediator. Psychology and social work reappear in Adriana's life as an epiphenomenon of what she calls spirituality. Nowadays, she combines psychology with the incorporation of entities from Afro-Brazilian religions in a center founded by her she describes as a place of cure, a place of self-knowledge. I quote, Adriana, I say that I started understanding why I studied psychology, because the psychological mental dimension of people, the perception they have of spirituality, is totally corrupted by the logic of consumption, she says. Therefore, I understood that I was not being a good mediator of spirituality as a form of self-knowledge, and that the kind of work that I do is not a terreiro. It's not a temple, it's a place of cure, a place of self-knowledge, and that spirituality is a tool, together with psychology. Thus, I'm using this fusion format, as she says, and this is why I started working with the Gypsy. The Gypsy is an Afro-Brazilian religious entity that she uses, as we shall see. After my Mai died, and she, the spirit of the dead Gypsy, does therapy based on past lives. What she does is regressions, she says. Only I am in trance, but she's the one who leads, it's a portal for past lives. And she, the Gypsy who is incorporated by Adriana, uses my knowledge of psychology, what I know, what I have studied for the care of people. End of quote. The taking of therapy carried out by Adriana at her institute is therefore based on a close collaboration between humans, herself, who provides her psychological expertise, and the interdisciplinary team of therapists that she trains, and spiritual agents, the Gypsy, whose spirit Adriana incorporates when needed, as well as other elements of Afro-Brazilian and indigenous Brazilian religions. The relationship thus established between the human and spiritual agents is one of complementarity and collaboration. Each agent contributes to the therapeutic task with their area of speciality. And all this is made possible through the mediation of Adriana, who condenses in herself the assemblage of elements pertaining to different ontologies. She is at the center of a new therapeutic configuration built upon the hybridization of a variety of elements. Not only does she create new knowledge and new therapeutic practice, but also through the articulation of different ontologies, reformulates both modern psychology in the indigenous Afro-Brazilian religions. The spirit of the Gypsy and the modern therapeutic techniques are thus assembled into a single and yet complex therapeutic network. According to the nature of the pathology of the patient, Adriana resorts to the Gypsy, to what she describes as spiritual practices, or to other techniques that include different forms of psychotherapy and the use of music and art. Nonetheless, the Gypsy's spirit also draws on modern and scientific therapeutic techniques. I quote, "Some people need therapy of past lives. Others need therapy associated to art. I see where spirituality fits and where psychology fits. Then when it's with the Gypsy, it is more past lives, more spirituality, regression, hypnosis." Moreover, Adriana also started experimenting with other techniques associated to the New Age, such as Oriental therapies, acupuncture, yoga, etc. For Adriana, therapy in all its forms is fundamentally a form of self-knowledge. But how Adriana came to this particular articulation of psychology, Afro-Brazilian religions, and New Age resources? How is Adriana's therapeutic network and her subjectivity constructed? In Adriana's own words, it was her approach to the Afro and indigenous tradition that provided her with a better understanding, not only for her own role as a psychologist, but also of her choice of psychology as a profession. And now we're going to describe a little bit of her encounter with the other world, with the non-human entities. According to Adriana's narrative, her true entry, this is the way she defines it, into the Afro-Brazilian religiosity, and more generally speaking, her contact with different ontologies, was unexpected. At some point, while doing research for her graduate degree, she bought an old semi-abandoned house by the sea in Niterói, of the city of Rio de Janeiro. As soon as she moved in, Adriana started noticing strange things happening around the house. And for this reason, even neighbors, particularly children, avoid it. While doing some renovations in the garden, which required the removal of earth, Adriana unearthed strange objects, as she said. At the beginning, she took a secular and rational attitude towards her findings. She simply threw the objects away in order to organize the garden according to her taste. Soon, she does not specify how soon. soon, she does not specify how soon, a fig tree started growing in the garden. And Adriana soon realized that there was something uncanny going on with the tree. From the vantage point of her present knowledge of our Brazilian religions, Adriana points out that there is in fact a non-human entity associated to what grows to what's growing in the fig trees, something she claims she was unaware of at that time. Therefore, she had to confront the fact that behind plants and objects, there was a different reality in which human and non-human actants interacted. And that required conceptual tools to interpret that were different from the ones she had available at that time. Through this experience, she entered in contact with other forms of reality throughout the materiality of objects. At the same time, Adriana also began experiencing behavioral changes that she could not explain. She became irritable and started drinking and smoking heavily. Moreover, other unexplainable phenomena occur with the house. Objects moved by themselves. She started hearing unexpected noises. Her son suffered episodes of somnambulism, etc. In her own words, I quote, she says like that: spiritual phenomena started taking place in the house. Things that fell down by themselves, phenomena that for me were supernatural. I did not believe in God. I was super rationalist, serious, critical of those things. Then literally things started to fall down by themselves, phenomena with animals, the cat became struck by horror. People that were fine as they entered the house, they started fighting, hit each other, started bleeding, vomiting, and I said, there is something wrong in this house. My neighbors are right. This house is strange. While these episodes were taking place, Adriana was pursuing her graduate courses. At the same time, she also held an administrative position at the university to support herself. There, she had a workmate who was also a graduate in psychology and who Adriana described in the interview as a kind of witch. Adriana decided to ask her for help. It's worth noting that although Adriana insisted that at that time she was a rational person, as she said, rationality that she associated with her Marxist sympathies, the first solution that came to her mind to confront her problems presupposed the presence of non-human spiritual entities belonging to an ontology that was far away from her rational world. She was a psychologist, but instead of consulting another psychologist or a psychiatrist in search for a scientific explanation for her behavioral changes and the other issues related to the house, she chose to approach someone who was a kind of witch. She was thus bridging the gap existent between two or more different ontologies. How can we explain this apparent paradox between her behavior and what she claims that she was at that time? A possible answer is related to Adriana's early life history, something that came to light later in the interview. Although Adriana kept insisting in that her entry into the spiritual world came as an adult, the fact is that her relationship with different forms of non-human agents are dated early in her life. Adriana's primary socialization took place in the bosom of a family, her own, where non-human spiritual actors were even present. Like many other middle-class Brazilians, Adriana's mother was very active in Kardashian spiritualist circles, becoming herself a recognized medium. Moreover, she, and this is also fairly common in Brazil, combined her adherence to Kardashism with Umbanda and other Afro-Indigenous religions. Adriana remembered that in one opportunity when she was around 10 years old, she had to come to the aid of her mother, who was in trance after incorporating entities. Adriana's subjectivity was constructed in an environment in which the presence of such entities and their ability to influence human actors was taken for granted. Furthermore, she also started seeing and hearing strange things. I quote, I always saw things and heard things. From early childhood, I saw things coming through the window. I was scared and I used to hide myself under the bed. The relationship between Adriana and this kind of non-human actors continue. She soon learned that her older sister also incorporated entities. I quote, and then my older sister told me that she had undergone many of those phenomena of trance incorporation, And I, as the majority of Brazilians, found that those references were more African, more indigenous. Going back to the line of her narrative, Adriana recounted that her friend, the psychologist, the kind of witch, took her to an institute she was a member of where they practiced magic. However, she decided that she needed other kind of help. I quote, because I needed an Afro priest for the house. It is noteworthy that Adriana did not make any attempt to look for possible natural causes of her troubles, in spite of her claimed Marxist rationality. It seems that by default, Adriana chose a supernatural explanation and therapy for her distress without, at the same time, abandoning her training as a psychologist. It was through one of the members of the Capoeira group Adriana was attending that she came in contact with a Jurema priestess from her native Pernambuco. Jurema is another Afro-Brazilian religion from Pernambuco, in fact. The priestess had to travel to Rio de Janeiro to handle family issues and offer her expert knowledge to solve the situation that was troubling Adriana. As the priestess arrived in Adriana's house and became informed of the details, she told Adriana that Adriana, was destined to occupy a high position in Jurema religion. Following this encounter, Adriana became officially incorporated into the universe of the traditional religions, although at the beginning she was reluctant to take such a step. I quote, "The priestess said Adriana, you are not going to have a lower position in the Jurema religion, of course. You will be very happy within the African indigenous traditions in the Terreiro, and you will occupy a non-minor position. Then, like this, they are your people there. You do understand? Go on." And I was not happy. I was feeling fine in the house. Then I became pregnant with my second son. But when she spoke about the issue of me having a position in Jurema, a place as a spiritual caregiver, because I remember Francisco Javier, I said, "Fuck, I will do nothing of my life. I will have to live only to do charity. I will have a multitude at my door." I spent that night awake. I cried. I said, "I will have to stop working." Francisco Xavier, known as Chico Xavier, has been a very well-known medium, author of literally hundreds of books on spiritism that were, according to him, not written by him, but dictated by the entities. While the priestess was informing Adriana of her fate, she, the priestess, incorporated the spirit of a female gypsy. For reasons that Adriana did not elaborate on, this incorporation changed her perception of the whole situation. I quote, "At that moment, she, the priestess, touched me and jumped backwards and incorporated the gypsy. And I found the gypsy most beautiful because I was scared to death to spend the night there alone. But when I saw the entity singing there in the fig tree, mighty, firm, then started the whole thing of spirituality. She talking in a confusing way, in a language that Adriana could not understand. I couldn't understand anything, but I found everything very beautiful. I felt very well in her presence, very well." The spirit of the dead gypsy became part of Adriana's present and would have a profound influence in her future professional life, as we have seen. She summons her when needed for therapeutic purposes. The past became actualized and was made present. The borders between past and present became blurred. From that moment on, Adriana started experimenting a feeling of internal peace. Eventually, she became pregnant and felt a great interior harmony. It's a quote, "great interior harmony." After the whole experience, Adriana started an ambitious and unique cultural therapeutic project. One of her primary goals was to disseminate knowledge and educate people on her newly discovered Afro-Indigenous religions and cultures. I quote, "The big difference of the kind of work that we do there, besides having a spiritual dimension, is that you go there to learn maracatu, an Afro-Brazilian performance gen practice in Pernambuco. But then you will not learn only the music. You will learn a history. This is part of the culture, because otherwise you will not be doing maracatu. You will be just following the rhythm. but Maracatu is an ancestral culture.
Nicolas,
However,
there are 5 minutes remaining.
Perfect. Okay, I'm finishing. However, the institute she's created has also a strong therapeutic purpose. As we said, Adriana provides various forms of therapy, articulating elements from Afro-Indigenous religions with modern psychotherapy, as well as with elements usually associated to the New Age. Well, just to finish the exposition, Adriana's narrative is complex and requires a close analysis. She manifests a deeply reflexive attitude towards the practices she is involved. The construction of her subjectivity has also been a complex process. Her early life experience linked to Spiritism through her mother and sister brought her close to an heteronomous and relational idea of the self. For her actions were conditioned by external factors and non-human spiritual agents. Even her approach to the Jurema religion and her becoming a heterodox Mai de Santo was conditioned by her ancestors, as well as by the call of the soul, as she says. And in the episode of the house, as well as in others, agency seems to be located elsewhere, outside of her, mostly in spiritual agents. And this appeared to have been naturalized by Adriana. However, throughout her narrative, there also emerged an autonomous notion of the self, one that in the sociological literature is associated to modernity, and which is considered as a foundation and necessary condition for the emergence and development of therapeutic cultures. Adriana is the one who most of the times takes the initiative to act. In contrast to other interviewees who belong to the academic or professional world and who at some point cross the border from one conceptual universe and reality to another one, Adriana has dismantled the frontiers between different worlds and ontologies to conform a therapeutic assemblage composed of various forms of religiosity, psychoanalysis, or psychology in general, and other practices that shed light on each other and on her own subjectivity. Adriana's persona as an adult seems to be situated between two ontologies, one associated to modern psychology, Marxism and rationalism, and another one associated to non-human actants, spirituality, and the Afro-Indigenous Brazilian religions. Moreover, there are at stake two conceptions of the self, an autonomous one and an heteronomous one. The relationship she established with non-human spiritual agents like the gypsy is symmetrical. It is a relationship of collaboration and not of subordination or heteronomy, as it is usually the case in the Terreiros. She summons the gypsy spirit to collaborate with her as she does with other human members of the team, medical doctors or psychologists. Adriana's mediations can hardly be considered as a pigeon, a simple hodgepodge amalgamation of heterogeneous elements, since instead they constitute a system of action developed in a reflexive fashion. Adriana knows very well why and how each element of the therapeutic network fits into her therapeutic assemblage and course of therapeutic action. Moreover, she is the one who takes the initiative and the leadership of the therapy, thus administrated and acts as the head of the therapeutic team, including over its non-human members. In this process, Adriana operates as an ontological mediator. Her therapeutic practice is at the same time a way to connect human and non-human actants, using Latour's terminology, and a way to reconnect past and present. Adriana's narrative thus sheds light on the complexities of the conformation of contemporary therapeutic networks, particularly in Latin American societies. Clearly, what Adriana and many people like her has built is a therapeutic network. However, far from being constructed around an individualistic and autonomous notion of the self and on the centrality of a therapeutic dyad, what we see here is a hybrid form of mobilization of an equally hybrid set of actants, both human and non-human, modern and traditional, all integrated into a single network. The therapeutic is constructed precisely in the in-between space, making different, seemingly incommensurate ontologies equally accessible. Adriana's case is illustrative, but by no means unique among our subjects from Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro. In her network, both the local as well as the transnational are clearly operative. The final product is hybrid in this regard too. Well, that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation and the perfect timing as well. So this concludes the presentations for this panel. So I want to open up to questions. I think there will be not only questions regarding these 4 presentations, but also with connections with previous ones. But in any case, let me start with a question comment sent through YouTube by Jose Miguel Garay Rivera, and this is for Edgar. Let me rephrase or translate it. Given that positive education is symptomatic of a long tradition of therapeutic pedagogies, how does one approach it? How does one approach both phenomena within a program or within a research program? And the question continues. There are interventions that replicate the same ideological component of positive pedagogy, but there are interventions that replicate the same ideological component of positive pedagogy, but these interventions are not under its name, under its aegis. That is, for example, emotional education that could be, I'm not quite sure what but basically saying emotional education can also have similar interventions. So Edgar, I'm not sure if the question was clear. Do you want me to repeat it, or actually what I can do is maybe I can send it through the chat.
He can read it in the chat.
He
can read it in the chat. Is it written in Spanish? He can read it in the chat.
It is, yeah. So I'm going to send it through the chat. Just one question.
Yeah, I'm reading the question here in the YouTube website.
In any case, I sent it through the chat so that, so that everyone in this Zoom session also has access to it.
I'm not even in Spanish. I'm sure that I'm translating well the question, but about it, thanks Jose Miguel for the question. I will say, because he says that emotional education can take many shapes, as many shapes as the professionals applying that idea. That is true, and that's certainly one of the problems when we study this kind of movements, because there is no a single movement, but a cluster of similar movements. One of the things I wanted to highlight in the presentation is that not even a field that has a very specific name like the one I talked about, positive education, has a consensual definition, because not even those who say that are applying positive education or that they are doing research on positive education can actually define what positive education is. So they do not even have an idea of what the field is really about. There is even discussions between them. So I have said elsewhere that the lack of definition of these movements are actually not a disadvantage for them. Actually, is a strong advantage for them to remain nebulous, heterogeneous. Why? Because they disseminate quite quickly. For example, if you can have a lot of practitioners, coaches, self-help writers, educational consultants, that they can say that they are applying the field of positive education to any school, or that they can provide some interventions to children based on the scientific field of positive education. So it disseminates quite quickly, because anyone can really take whatever it wants from that field or from that ideas. For example, some of them can apply some ideas of mindfulness. Some people can focus on emotional intelligence. Some people can really give or do interventions based on resilience or optimism, of positive strength characters. The idea that it is not defined, it is an advantage for them to disseminate quickly in the popular sphere. So no one can claim actual ownership of the movement. Anyone can contribute and do some research and relate the research to the movement. So the movement becomes quite difficult to define, and it's not only an advantage for them to quickly disseminate in different spheres of the popular realm, but it is also an advantage for them, because it is hard for researchers who are doing critical work to actually criticize them, because we really have to consider everything that can be, considered as positive education. So, for example, when I write about the topic, even positive educators, the ones who self-proclaim as positive educators, say that what I'm analyzing is not exactly positive education, because it is a mix between positive education and emotional education and character education. So the point is that it is difficult to define, because it is a whole network of people working under very similar ideas, and the similar ideas is those that I try to underline in the presentation. Is these assumptions that psychological factors are always more determinant of success and failure in the educational system that social and contextual factors. For example, that's an idea that brings all them together, and of course they take different names, but most of them share the same psychological premises, but also ideological premises. So that's why sometimes I try to combine the scientific criticism or the more technical criticism with the more cultural and ideological analysis of these movements.
Okay, thank you. Yes, lots of definitional issues at stake there. Let's move on to Xochitl. I've been listing people as they were announcing by the chat that they have questions, if you don't mind, but I'll put you down next. So entonces, Xochitl, you're next.
Thank you. Well, I have two questions, one for Diana and one for Mauro. So I'm just going to say both. And so my question to Diana is about, I really love your presentation and I'm interested in listening and sound. So that's very, very important for my own research. So one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, how do you define noise? Because, ethnomusicologists have always thought about it as disorganized sound. but also they emphasize that noise is essentially relational and entailing this kind of meta-discourse of sound. So I wanted to ask you how, I mean, these people that you work with, how is sound defined? And the other, and the other question / comment has to do with acoustomology. And I was just thinking if you've encountered that, and how would you relate that to your work? And of course, just because you're also working with trauma and the horrible stuff that happened in Chile, I'm also thinking about acoustomatic, Pierre Schaeffer's idea about listening without seeing. So I see a direct relationship between blinding and listening. So those are just some questions / comments that I would like you to maybe help me through. And Mauro, very quickly, just I have a question about Peter Frosch, especially since you brought him up in your talk. And because he has been extremely clear that psychoanalysis only can happen within the clinical encounter. And he's very critical precisely of people who uses psychoanalysis in other contexts. I mean, in the case that you were providing politics, because for him, it entails transference. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. I mean, like so what exactly it is that these authors are doing with psychoanalysis outside the clinical setting? I mean, so how did they, think about it or think about it? And just since I'm Edgar, I'm just thinking about the founder of positive psychology. I was just reading an interview precisely at Clarín, in which he actually accuses psychoanalysis of being a depressive methodology because it actually makes you go inside your, intimate self. So I just wanted to mention that I found fascinating that he thinks psychoanalysis is depressive. So anyway, just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for
maybe we can start with Diana. Yeah. Responding.
Thank you for your questions. I'm not really sure I can answer them that well, but I'll try. In relation to noise, noise in paranormal investigations are usually the sort of prima materia of the spirit world. So as much, the more noise there is in an environment, the more added noise, the more not human noise, but electrical noise, the more the spirit world has with which to confection their words or their images, right? So this idea of the gyratory pump that I talked about in these mind complexes that they go and study in Antofagasta, it's to provide the environment with the extra stuff, like it's the difference that makes a difference. And it's that difference in which we can understand what information is, right? And in that sense, it's noise, it's chaos, it's designed chaos, it's designed to interfere with the environment. But then it provides the stuff which the other world confections its own information to give you, right? Of course, this for psychoanalysts, for psychologists who actually were the first critics of EVP, they weren't the engineers, they were the psychoanalysts. They said, but this noise, it's basically a way for mind to project itself, right? So it's a sort of a Rorschach of a person's intentions and motivations, unconscious or otherwise. So I think the initial reaction from not from academia, because academia didn't really take it seriously, but from the first critics of EVP was that they stayed at this chaos level, right? But of course, in relation to the people that I study, the paranormalists, it is just the foundation for something else which comes later, right? And it's not just noise in terms of sound. So when I say noise, I don't just mean the acoustic waves. I mean vibration itself, reverberation, which could also mean energy of some kind or another, right? In relation to acoustomology, I don't really know how to answer you because it's in this book, noise is one of my chapters. Another one is affect, another one is machines, and what I want to do is basically reconfigure this entire field so that we're not looking just at machines as machinic, in which every paranormal moment has its own designs, its own forms, which are recursive within themselves, but they also have torques outwards, and then they sort of torque back inwards. So you can see these things by themselves, right? This is what Handelman also said in relation to ritual forms. He said that it's about time that we don't just look at ritual or religious belief as something which then relates to political, social, medical factors, right? We need to look at these things by themselves, on themselves, and then do the relating after, which is sort of what I want to do with all these concepts as well. Not sure if I answered you, but there you go.
Okay, thank you. Let's see Mauro responding to her question.
Well, thanks for your question. Yes, I was surprised to find the Frost last name in your paper, and with such curious and specific conception of psychoanalysis, to the point that I wonder if we are not having a communication problem here and we are talking about different Frost. The Frost I am talking about is different Frost.
Perdón, te escucha muy mal, por lo menos yo te escucho muy mal. ¿Podés acercarte al micrófono, buscar alguna...? Ahora te veo al revés, pero eso es otro tema. O tal vez desconectar el video.
El video. Sí.
Now,
Yes.
can you hear me now? I
Better.
would say that I was surprised to find the last name Frost in Ochil's paper, because he was quoted with an incredibly purist or very, very clinical approach to psychoanalysis, to the point that I wonder if we are not having a communication understanding here, and we are talking perhaps about two different Frosts, because Stephen Frost is the person I'm referring in my paper, in my exposition, and he is a historian and he specializes in institutional psychoanalysis. He makes psychoanalysis of institutions, and he's a wonderful historian of psychoanalysis. He has wrote very interesting stuff on psychoanalysis within Nazism, but he has this a prioristic conception that psychoanalysis is intrinsically progressive, and well, it is not always useful for historians to proceed in that way. And along with Jane and Mariano, we have a discussion with him, one of the issues of the journal Cultura C, in which we entangle in an interesting conversation about, well, how to deal with these issues around politics and psychoanalysis. So that was my surprise when I met Frost in your paper, and I wonder if you are talking about a Peter Frost, using a Stephen Frost, and maybe that would explain a bit.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mauro. Xochitl's third question was to Edgar, so we're listening to your response.
Oh, sorry, I would say that that was not a question, but a
It
comment,
was a comment.
right?
Yeah, it was just a comment. Thank you, Edgar. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you for the comment anyway.
Okay, in that case, let's move on to Diana, who said that she would like to comment, ask question.
Thank you. Nicholas, I just have, I think, a quick comment for you, and that is, well, a question embedded in a comment, and that is if you've read the work of Douglas Holland on the constructivist models of consciousness, and Catherine Ewing, who are two anthropologists who are very psychoanalytically oriented, and they have some interesting concepts on the self. Douglas Holland has this idea of a self system, which I find super interesting also because I also work with possession religions. And so the idea is that a person is sort of fragmented and dispersed naturally. It's not like we're coherent from the start. And we oscillate between zones of consciousness and unconsciousness. And that this is very well seen, for instance, in possession experiences where some parts of the self communicate with other parts of the self, and also in dream experiences. And I find that very fascinating because, in a sense, you don't have to posit that there are two ontologies that this self is going through or self is deciding between, right? This idea that you have the rationalist self and the animist self. I think there are other options. And one of the options is this idea of self-system. And Catherine Ewing is very interesting as well because she has this article called The Illusion of Wholeness, where she argues that selves are inherently inconsistent and incoherent. And in essence, they self-represent only in relation to their context, right? So it's just a comment for you to perhaps read these authors and see how they would relate to your work.
Okay. Now, Nicolas, do you want to respond or?
Okay, perfect. No, thank you very much, Jana, for the commentary. In fact, you said Douglas Holland. Yeah, I know him, but Catherine, could you put it on the chat, the name? Because I don't know her. Yes, this is well, this is something that we have been discussing a lot with Vito and Mariano, and trying to think about that. If there are two ontologies in relationship, or is the same with two parts? We are trying to find some word. We're discussing the concept of partial connection to try to understand something about that. But what you are saying is something more, if I presume, is more connected with psychological anthropology. And it could be a good idea to have a look of that. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, let's go to Rodrigo. If you might want to reiterate or rehash the comment that you sent by the chat.
Yeah, it was a small comment, but I can turn it into a question addressed to Edgar, because when I said in the chat, it was that one could think that happiness it's a good example of an empty signifier about the talk that Mauro gave, which means that the lack of meaning its power. That was something that Edgar was saying. So if this is true, while I was listening to his presentation, I was wondering if the idea, the strategy of doing a hard science critique of positive psychology or positive education is the best political strategy, because it is obvious that they use science as a rhetoric resource to validate, and to persuade people. And so I don't really think, and as Edgar said, they don't really care. Their success doesn't depend at all if we do this kind of critiques, because their game is exactly that one, to use this kind of empty signifiers, which has a lot of power, ideological power, because we think they are blessed with science. That's what they say. And so if we criticize them through science, aren't we in a way playing their game, assuming they are science?
Thank you, Rodrigo.
Thank you, Rodrigo, because it's very important and interesting questions. Of course, I have thought about it like many times, because the ideological and cultural critique, I have done that many times before. And sometimes you need to widen that kind of critique. Why is important to criticize the scientific basis of that kind of movement? Because, okay, you and me and many others can agree that they are using science as a mere rhetoric, just to gain power of authority, just to be more persuasive. But for example, those who fund, who give money to these movements are not that sure. And maybe for those who are giving, really sustaining that kind of research, that kind of interventions, those who are, for example, teachers in schools or schools themselves who are really interested in something that helps them and that they do not have the knowledge. If you go and say that it's a neoliberal movement, they will tell you, okay, I don't care. Does it work or not, right? That's what they want to know. And in the end, that criticism is important because it's also something that we have in our power to convince those who are not convinced by the ideological argument or by the cultural analysis. You and I are convinced by that, so we have enough, but not those who really believe that they might be useful for certain, I don't know, objectives they might have, certain needs they might have, and of course, it is also important for those, as I said, for those who really give them the money. So I will say that it is really important, and criticizing them by using their own words, by playing their game, it is not necessarily legitimizing them as a science. Actually, what I'm trying to do here is casting serious doubts over the scientific quality of that movement. I have found that when I do so, my criticism is quite effective in certain realms, certain spheres. For example, that criticism works where the ideological analysis does not. So it is helpful. I will say that we have to do both. Although I said in my presentation that from my point of view, what is really important is the cultural and ideological critique, because in the end, it's what underlies everything. So that's what I try to connect, the ideological criticism with the technical or scientific criticism, because I also want to demonstrate that that ideology is also affecting the science they are using. But you have to demonstrate it, or you have to be convincing about it. You have to make the link for them, for those who want to listen to you, to your criticism. If you just say that you are doing a scientific criticism on the one hand and an ideological criticism on the other, it just won't work. So I understand your question. I agree with your doubts. I share them, but I will say that it's important to do both.
Thank you, Edgar. Let's move on to Jane's question.
First of all, I would like to congratulate the organizers for this for the seminar. All the presentations were very, very interesting. My comment to Edgar was more or less in the same line of Rodrigo. I was going to exactly point out that the problem regarding positive education I don't think the scientific criticism is what should be done, because it's a political struggle. It's a political struggle. It's not that their science is affected by ideology. There is only ideology when we speak about happiness or well-being, which are impossible to give a definition of happiness, a scientific definition of well-being. Here we have only values. These are absolutely these are value questions. So it's only, I understand what you said when you said, well, we have to show those who believe in this positive education the scientific failures. Okay, but as long as it's very clear that this is a political struggle, and that even if you have research that says it doesn't work, the definition of working for an education is absolutely crucial for the argument. So as long as it's very, very clear that the scientific criticism is a tool of political struggle, because it's political struggle. More or less, I was going to say the same thing Rodrigo said. And also, I'll repeat Diana also, speaking about the work of Mariano, Nicholas, and Piroska. When you say that Adriana is more or less in between or between two ontologies, and you also told us her history is that her family, there was already this experience of this kind of traditional religion, spirituality in her family. She was used to it since she was a kid. So then she says, okay, I became a rationalist, psychologist, Marxist. But she had already had that experience. For her, that was not something strange. That was something that she had experienced in her daily life, her mother and so on. So I think that might we speak of an ontology, a mixed ontology, or an ontology that we can speak of that carries a rationalist approach, and also, how would we call it, non-rationalist? I don't know how to call it. Because even if we say, oh, she's a psychologist, and so she has a rationalist approach, but psychology is not always rationalist. It's not always also. So I think there's a combination, as she says, a collaboration, when she says the gypsy and the doctors and the psychology, she wants them to collaborate, right? So I think that we might speak of a collaboration, of an ontology. It's not that she's between ontologies, but it's a complicated mixed ontology. Just to, I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying, but just to, so we can talk.
Okay, so first let's hear Edgar's reaction to. I don't know if you want to add something.
Yeah, well, I would like to answer James' remark. Well, I will answer more or less the same to what I said to Rodrigo, but I would like to add something. You said that, well, you mentioned, well, the important thing is the political struggle, not the scientific one. And I said, I will say, well, it is not. Who says that science is not political in a way? So maybe the problem, if we give up the scientific criticism, and I give you the problem back here. It is not a way to acknowledge that politics and science are two different things. For example, if we give up to analyzing the scientific problems, because as I tried to show, and they are not separated. They cannot be separated, and that same analysis is also criticism to those movements, in this case, positive education, that defend that science and politics are two different things, and they are just doing science. And so the criticism is the following: is your movement is extremely political. You're saying that you're only doing hard science, but you're not working as a hard science, and you're not even working as a science or as a good science. And I'm also showing you that the scientific and the political are related. So what I'm doing is trying to provide the whole criticism and the whole circle. I understand the problems here, and sometimes I've only focus on the ideological part, and that's it. And sometimes only in the technical part, and that's it. And in times like this, for example, I decided to just give a little bit of both. But I think, because I think that it is important to not to separate them, because otherwise we will be acknowledging what we don't want to acknowledge. In that case, that science and politics are two different things. So I understand the questions and the doubts, but yeah, more or less what I told to Rodrigo is my opinion. Of course, it's an opinion, but I think it's well, it's more important to do this than just focus on one side of the problem, because they are all related.
Okay, thank you. For Jane's other comment, I don't know if Mariano or Nicolas, which of you wants to take it?
Can I take it, Nicolas? And then if you want, you can add something.
Okay, yeah. No, just...
Yeah, please go ahead if you want to say something before.
No, we can say, we both could say something. It's just a very short thing to answer the question, the suggestion of Gianni. That in fact, what I was thinking about is that what we have in focus is the traditional conceptions of hybridization in the sense of Garcia Canclini and that kind of literature. And trying to say that there are two ontologies is a discussion we are having, in fact, but it exists in nature terms. Adriana, in this case, she recognized that as a psychologist, she has some kind of dimension, and as a Afro-Brazilian practitioner has another one. So, in fact, we have to say something about that. I don't think it's just the same thing. Of course, nobody thinks that, but the concept of hybridization that we are using is something that we are trying to use that term in a new way that is not the Garcia Canclini sense, like the mixture of cultural traces or symbolic things. It's an assemblage of different relationships. Of course, it's the same structure. She can use the psychology, or she can stay in contact with the gypsy, and it's part of the same system in some kind. But that system in the public dimension of social sciences and the public perception of culture are things that are separated. So we have to say something about that. I think that you are right in the sense that for her, everything is connected, but for social sciences, the anthropology of psychology or the anthropology of religion are two different sub-disciplines. So in the public's opinion, those things are the separated things, and for Adriana are separated things. But in terms of her own practice and her everyday life, is something that is connected. So I think that you have a point there. I think it's a very complex discussion, but I thank you for the comment.
No, I wanted to add that it's also important the way in which all the things came up in the interview, in the way and the structure of the interview, because Adriana was telling us that she was a psychologist and she started, presenting herself as an academic, and she said that she dated exactly her entrance into the world of spirituality. She said that it took place at one particular moment when she bought a house in Niterói, and where the house was full of entities, and that before that she had been a Marxist, rationalist, agnostic, non-believer, whatever. But then, as the interview progressed, toward the end of the interview, she started telling us her previous story, which was not part of her narrative, original narrative. So at some point she said, well, in fact, when I was a kid, my mother was a Kardashian spiritist and so on. So this is why we couldn't add all that in this short presentation, but the structure of in other words, when we're talking about multiple ontologies, although it is an analytic category, of course, because she doesn't talk about ontologies, we are sort of taking seriously her own narrative, and this is why the things appear the way they did. I don't know if I'm clear.
Mariano, she has kids, but does she have a husband?
She lives alone. She doesn't mention she doesn't mention a husband, as far as I remember in the whole interview. That's interesting. But she said that she was a kid. She had a kid, and then she had all these problems. And then after she discovered this gypsy, she could have a second son, and then she went up to Pernambuco and so on and so forth. But all that appeared completely sort of disassembled in her narrative. So she was telling about this her history of entering into the spiritual world in a kind of linear narrative, and then at the end appear all these other elements. So this is also interesting. Of course, it's just one of the many interviews that we have made. Go ahead.
Yeah, it just seemed like a case that is sort of massive, shows massively this kind of hybridization that we've been talking about. I actually had a question myself for Diana, but unfortunately she had to leave, so therefore we move on to Carlos.
Thank you. First, I have to apologize with all this turning on and off my camera, but I am having problems with my internet, so please bear with me. Second, I want to thank you because I have learned a lot from the previous presentations. I actually like them all, and that is one of the things that I appreciate of these meetings. You come here and learn, and I am trying to put these things in terms of my own interests. I don't have a question, I have comments, and I am afraid that I don't have these comments and these ideas very well articulated, but I am going to tell them anyway. The first one, we keep using neoliberalism as if we were perfectly clear as to what is the meaning of neoliberalism. Perhaps we should stop a bit and think whether there may be more than one meaning of liberalism or one particular application of liberalism in a particular context, historical context or geographical context. Here, the idea of neoliberalism, of course, is very relevant in Colombia, and it comes a lot from the Chilean model, the so-called Chilean model. The idea of the Chuck Doctrine, Naomi Klein, the Chicago Boys, and all that. The so-called Chilean model here is very much commended upon by the neoliberal, again, economists in this country, which, by the way, work within the frames of my own university, the School of Economics from the University of Los Andes. They are the ones who are ruling the economy of this country for many years, and they admire the Chilean model. But I'm afraid they don't follow it quite through because, for instance, they apply a lot of subsidies, subsidies, subsidize in the economy, and that is not exactly neoliberal. Okay. By the way, and this goes to Diana, I was particularly taken by her presentation.
Unfortunately, she had to sign off. She had
Oh,
to leave.
what a
But
pity.
if you want to, I mean, in any case,
Well, I am going to give the comments anyway because I was particularly taken by her presentation.
No, one thing,
Because
yes,
noising this.
Carlos, tomorrow there's going to be a plenary discussion at the end, so we can ask her personally if you want.
Oh, okay. The problem, Mariano, that I have tomorrow is that I have to teach a seminar in the first part of our meeting. So I won't be able to be the first part of our meeting. I am going to be only for the second part. You know, but tomorrow is my fault. Okay, it doesn't matter. But I was particularly taken by her because of all this whole business of torture and protest and all that. Pardon? Yeah.
No, I was just saying if
Should I continue?
If you briefly, no, if it's not that, if you can briefly say it, maybe we can transmit it, some of it to her tomorrow in the general discussion.
Okay, so I'll stop you here, but no problem, no problem. I do have some other comments, because, for instance, to Mauro, the whole relationship between psychoanalysis and politics and leftist politics. There is a book out now by Michel Onfray, which is not very well known, very well within psychoanalytical histories, and he's now complaining in his latest book, which has been translated into Spanish, that psychoanalysis or orthodox psychoanalysis simply took away liberal leftist policies out of psychoanalysis. In particular, he mentions one of the authors that you are dealing with, Eric Fromm, and so on. Well, okay, tomorrow I'll have the chance perhaps to explain my views a bit longer.
I didn't mean to cut short. Just the opposite. I was saying if you wanted to say something something about Diana's work and you won't be able to be there tomorrow, we can maybe.
No, it is. No, it's all right. It's all right. It's all right. I want to reflect upon the idea of neoliberalism as being a clear-cut concept, which I think it is not. I want to reflect upon the idea of the Chilean model of the whole problem of liberal economics and the whole problem of bringing back the past, bringing the past up to the present that Diana explained. The fact of noise. I belong to a culture in which noise is very much present. I wanted to comment a little bit about it. And finally, I wanted to comment a little bit about Adriana, which fascinated me, the story of Adriana. It really fascinated me. I'm looking forward to read that story in the book that we are publishing, because I think it is very important. And I think that it can come to Colombia and talk a lot of time with Padre Puerta, because this is the same kind of hybridization, and also with Taita Orlando Gaitan, you know. Well, but that has to wait a bit. Okay, that's all.
Okay. So the question is, who wants to bear on the question of neoliberalism? Whoever feels. Go ahead, Mauro.
Yes, I'm not sure this is a question and answer kind of situation. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes, we can.
No, but I was definitely, I totally agree with Carlos, and I think it would be extremely productive if tomorrow we find some time to make a wrap up of this discussion and take a moment to think about what has happened with the term neoliberalism. Back in the old days, the neoliberals were the guys who were cutting social spending. That was basically what was neoliberalism about. But at some point in the last years, there is a growing bibliography that redefines neoliberalism in terms of production of subjectivity at much more sophisticated terms around psychological techniques, technocracy, and there has been an interesting slippage. And I think if we continue using neoliberalism in terms, or as I found in my own research when I read some literature, that there is not a reflection about how this term has been transformed in the last years, and what can we say about this transformation? What does this transformation tell us about certain political or social nature change? So I just wanted to add that to Carlos' comment, which I totally agree with him.
Okay. If no one else wants to react to that, then we're going to go to a final question by Nicolas, in particular, given that we're a little bit running over time. I hope you don't mind. So Nicolas.
Okay, thank you, Piro. It's to Mauro, the question. Mauro, I really like your paper, but I was wondering about one thing. I don't have too much to say about the Mexican psychoanalyst because I don't know him. The case of Jorge Aleman is a very interesting case because he's very popular now in leftish groups in Buenos Aires. But I was to focus on Ernesto Lakla. I just wanted to say two things. One is why you put them together, because if you are focusing on the psychoanalysis profession, I see Ernesto Lakla in historical and in sociological terms as a part of another group, a group more close to social sciences and the influence, not just Lacan, but structuralism in the 70s. There's the second point that I want you to focus on. The first one is the networks of sociability. I understand that Jorge Aleman and the other one are psychoanalysts. Ernesto Lakla is not a psychoanalyst. He uses Lacan, of course, but he's part of another network of intellectuals, more close to Eliseo Verón, to Emilio de Ipola, and other group of intellectuals that comes from social sciences that in the 60s they got close to structuralism, not only psychoanalysis. For instance, the idea of empty signifiers or floating signifiers that Lakla uses from Lacan. In fact, that idea is Levi-Straussian. It's from Levi-Strauss. Levi-Strauss uses that idea. Lacan takes it from Levi-Strauss. And my point is that is it really Lacan the point, or is structuralism as a whole ideology that is important for that group, for the group of Lakla and the others? That's my point, because I feel that Lakla is part of that another group where Lacan is just another component of a big structure of intellectuals and references from structuralism in the 60s and the 70s in Argentina. And well, the crisis, the argument against the social, the idea of contingency, the idea of articulation is a very Althusserlian idea. My question is, my point is, why Lacan is so important? Because I understand that Lakla uses Lacan, but I see a mixture. Why you put them together? That's all. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your question. You are totally right, and I agree with you. And that's why in my position I was being so emphatic about how I am constructing a unity out of what I consider that could be put authors with very important differences, but they could be put together according to criteria by my own. But you know better than me, Nico, that readings and practices of symbolic practices, putting together heterogeneous traditions or elements from cultural spheres are precisely always idiosyncratic and creative in certain ways. So from a very specific and canonical place from intellectual history or history of social theory, we would never put maybe Lakla together with psychoanalysis. But if you explore the readings and the sympathies of many members of the community or some communities among Argentinian Lacanians or Lacanians in Buenos Aires, you will see that the prestige and the charisma of someone like Lakla is strong. And in certain manners, for instance, a very recent book by, not recent, but one of the first important interventions by Jorge Aleman was a book of different chapters, and one of the chapters was a congress in which he shared a conversation and an interaction with Lakla. And I took that as a kind of presentation where there's some charisma in Lakla, intellectual prestige, and because in certain certain manner, or definitely a very explicit manner, he opens up a region of interaction between Lacan and social theory and with political consequences, and the Lacanians in Argentina, a group of Lacanians in Argentina, found that extremely attractive. And so I think that there's a mix of readings which are constitutive of identity, cultural or political or professional identities. And on that sense, Lakla, in my opinion, should go put together with Aleman. When you read other authors, for instance, Avon de Cuésar, you see that he criticizes them both, like they are a common front. So he puts himself more in a more traditional Marxism against Lakla. What you say about the kind of intellectual that Lakla is or was, you can say the same about Zizek. However, all psychoanalysts with Zizek and try to incorporate them to their readings, and you have defined blogs and by Facebook pages and different kind of expression by psychoanalysts where Zizek is also incorporated. So I still have to work, you are totally right on that, on how the collection of ideas and the interaction of different authors work as symbolic material. And each kind theoretical reflection and symbolic production, in that sense, are put together. So incorporating an author is also incorporating a charismatic object, and certain ideas or concepts are also charismatic objects in certain sense. And I still working on how to try to incorporate a methodology which is not just connected to intellectual history or the history of ideas, but also how these ideas are put together in a theoretic manner. Although I still believe that there are logical connections in the way some authors are incorporated. And you are totally right in something I totally left unexplored and unmentioned, which is that many of these ideas can be tracked through Levi-Strauss and the whole issue about the criticism of structuralism. It's interesting how these authors also construct traditions of reflection. So many people, many young psychoanalysts read Lakla and then they go to read Althusser, which is perhaps the inverse experience that many people, older people who read Althusser and then they read Lakla. But now younger people have the inverse. But it's true that people in general, when I talk to them, I realize that people know about Kenyans in Argentina, they know about Lakla, they know a little about Althusser, and they totally they don't know anything about Levi-Strauss, well, the whole tradition of structuralism and the post-structuralist criticism of structuralism that you have to construct yourself. I don't know if that answers your question, but thank you very much anyway for your comment.
Okay. Thank you, Mauro. I just want to make sure, I'm not sure if maybe there was something you wanted to respond to Carlos's comment or reference to your work. Just want nothing remains sort of forgotten.
Oh, yes, I forgot. No, thanks, Carlos, for the reference to Onfray.
Mauro, sacate la imagen porque yo por lo menos tengo muchos problemas en escucharte. Y además estás más lindo ahí, así que...
Thank you. No, it's just thank you to Carlos for the reference. I will have to make some time to read Onfray. My perception is that there has been a lot of one-sidedness in the history of psychoanalysis in favor of psychoanalysis, and then Onfray is the kind of person who goes one-sided against psychoanalysis. But anyway, it's important to incorporate in my reading. That's what I think.
Okay, in that case, okay, so we would be concluding. I hope you don't mind having run over a little bit. I think it was really enriching to hear all these back and forth comments. With respect to tomorrow, we unfortunately it looks like Suvi Salmeniemi won't be able to participate tomorrow because she's under suspicion of having contracted COVID just on time. Hope she's doing well. In any case, I mean, let me submit this to you. In any case, I suggest that we convene at 9 o'clock at the time that was previously announced. And in any case, we can use the time either for having a longer break between the two sessions or just discussion as you wish. So if you agree with the 9 o'clock time of commencing, then we would do that. I don't know. I want to demo. What's your input on that?
Well, we are a minority, but since we are the present minority, we have privileges. I think that 9 o'clock is fine, and that's my personal opinion. And then we can extend the part of discussion, which is very interesting.
That's. I think, and also the rest of today might give us some more opportunity to rethink and also think about the possible connections between the different presentations.
She was expected to speak in the morning or in the afternoon. I don't remember.
In the morning. In the morning.
In the morning.
In the morning.
No, because perhaps someone in the afternoon could speak in the morning, because then we could have a break for lunch, for having lunch until 12:30, for instance, instead of earlier. We could have later.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to
suggestion,
pass someone from the afternoon to the morning.
Let's see. The panels have been determined along lines of sort of affinity between the papers.
I see. Yes,
so maybe what we could do, see those. I mean, they're thematic panels. So why don't we just go through with those two presentations, and then we can have an earlier break, or unless you feel like using that time for the discussion.
Well, I guess we can wait till tomorrow and see how things develop. I have no problems with personally with Jane's proposition. We can see how things develop tomorrow, because we have a panel of 2 people in the morning and 2 people in the afternoon. So we can perhaps have the 2 panels together in the morning and then go for a longer break and then come back for discussion. I mean, that depends on how
Mariano, it's not 3 people in the afternoon?
3, I see.
3.
Oh, there are 3.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we can perhaps,
in any case,
just one thing, we can finish 1 panel in the morning, start the other panel in the afternoon, and continue after the break. That's another possibility, and we can work it out.
So, but we maintain the 9 o'clock commencing.
I think it's
yes, Carlos.
Yes,
Carlos?
as I said, yes, thank you. As I said, I cannot make it at 9 o'clock because I have to teach this seminar. But and furthermore, I don't have the right to ask what I am going to ask. But could we have the papers by the people who are going to speak tomorrow?
The papers I sent you are the
I
ones. I
submitted my paper last night, and you haven't.
I have circulated the papers we have.
But there's a paper by I couldn't.
So
there's one paper that several of us I think could not open.
Toniol is there.
Toniol is there. Diana Russo is there. Sebastián Benítez is there. The only one which is not there is Daniel Neri, because Suvi Salmeniemi is not going to present. Her paper, I think, is there, but she's not going to be able to come. So Toniol is there.
No, I cannot open it up. I cannot open.
It's,
because
it's not easy to open.
No, it came in another
It is-
format. Yeah.
A ver, let's see. If someone can open it, could you maybe do us the favor of saving it in a Word or rich text format and resending it? It might be easier than trying to.
I couldn't open it either.
Okay.
I could not open it.
I finally managed to open it, so I'll try to transform it into Word and send it to you.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
right.
Or rich text file that would be perfect too.
Okay.
Okay. So in that case, well, we'll see you tomorrow at 9 Buenos Aires time, which is our reference time, and then you calculate your local time based on that.
Okay. Bye-bye.
I'll see you later in the morning.
Thank you all. See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
See you tomorrow. Bye.
Nico, Mariano.
Sí, acá estamos.
Y no cortemos.
Está Mauro también que. No se fue.
Bueno, ya salió.
Bueno, bien.
Bastante bueno. Deja de grabar ahora.
Sí, stop recording.
Quedó bastante bien. Algunos, por supuesto, desparejos, algunos más interesantes que otros, pero me parece que hubo buena discusión, ¿no?
Para que estoy asegurándome que no estamos grabando ni